Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. Today I will be talking about Because I Could Not Stop for Dead by Emily Dickinson and the concept of death in general. So that's why I named this file as Gentle as Death. Let's get started. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born in December 10th, 1830, Amherst, United States. She only published 10 of her works in her lifetime, and the themes of her works were mainly about death and spiritual life. She wrote about 800 poems and letters in her lifetime, but she never published them. Her works were published after her death by her sister and some relative of her. She passed away in May 15, 1886, when she was 55 years old. Where the inspiration comes from, Emily Dickinson was mostly affected by the Victorian era literature. She was a Christian girl, and a lot of her work referred to Jesus Christ in some way. She was an educated girl, she liked gardening, she liked writing poems and letters. She went to a Christian school as well. Her education was mostly Christian education and a lot of literature education. Her writing style changed after she lost her dear ones in life. She was sensitive toward her loved ones to begin with. Losing them one by one in a short time changed her writing style a lot. Her poems was mostly about Jesus and some plants before, but in a short period of time, she lost her lover, her friends, and her family members. So, from that period, her writing style changed a lot. In Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, the poet explains how the death was gentle and natural in many different ways. This is my thesis statement. Firstly, in the first stanza, the gentleman that takes the lady to his carriage is death itself. The carriage symbolizes the grave of the lady. The last line in the first stanza talks about an eternal life, which can be considered as afterlife that refers to the poet's religious persona. The gentleman, which is death itself, is so gentle for the lady. He stops the carriage for the lady to jump in. Also, she talks about an eternal life, which means that she's Christian and she believes in the afterlife that comes after death. Secondly, in the second stanza, the lady talks about how she left her labor and leisure behind when she started this journey. When a person dies, mundane aspects like work and desire does not matter anymore. We cannot take them with us to our afterlife. So this means however you try, how much you work, it doesn't matter after you die, because mundane aspects stays in earth. She also talks about death's civility, and this is the reason why she abandoned her labor and leisure behind. That was so gentle to her that she had to left all of the mundane aspects behind to show him respect. Emily Dickinson was a lady herself that had good manners. By this, I mean that Emily was a kind lady that knew how to behave because she was educated, and this is why she talks about this lady in the poem. Thirdly, in the last stanza, the poet talks about eternity that comes after death and how it is like shorter than a day. In eternity, time does not matter anymore, and it is not as fast as death itself. Hundreds of years can pass, but in eternity, this can look like a rice grain that was stuck to someone's face once. In eternity, centuries can pass, a lot of people can die, but eternity is forever. So centuries and other people does not matter anymore. In conclusion, the poet accepts death as what it is and tries to take it as a treasure that should be cherished forever. This is the tombstone of Emily Dickinson. Rest in peace. My personal take from this concept and the poem is, yeah, that can be depressing and sad most of the time. But living with the fear of that is scary, in my opinion. Everyone and everything will die eventually, but accepting this fact is the most important. We all know that we will die someday, or our loved ones will die someday. We should accept this because when you're not that surprised, that will not affect you that much. If you're surprised about this, and if you live like this will not happen anytime soon, you will be sad and you can't move on from this. If you want to move on from this, you have to accept this fact. Literature-wise, Emily Dickinson was a huge fan of metaphysical poetry when she was still a schoolgirl. She liked British Victorian-era poets such as John Donne and George Herbert. These poets often wrote about nature, mortality, and afterlife. Many years later, she is one of the biggest names of this type of poetry. This poem, Because I Could Not Stop for That, particularly is one of her most famous poems. She was a huge fan of British Victorian era poets. She liked their writing style and probably the concept of metaphysical poetry because she was inspired by them. She took the mortality and afterlife to her most of her works, and she is like one of the biggest names of American poetry, and a lot of people that is interested in poetry knows her name. Thank you for your attention.